You've never been kissed, the giant cowgirl asked, stepping closer. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin the story. The dusty town of Willow Creek sat nestled between vast fields of golden grass and rugged hills. It was a quiet, forgotten place, where life moved at the pace of the wind, slow and steady, but unyielding. The townspeople had their routines, their faces were familiar, and their whispers about the people who lived in the hills were equally familiar. There was one name that always seemed to spark curiosity, one name that made folks tilt their heads and whisper behind closed doors. Lila the giant cowgirl. Lila wasn't like other women in Willow Creek. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and calloused hands, she was a woman built by the land. But it wasn't just her size that made people uneasy. It was her strength. Lila had earned her living as a rancher, working day in and day out, hauling heavy loads, wrestling cattle, and tilling the soil in a way that no one else in town could. But despite her physical prowess, Lila had one thing that set her apart from the men who worked alongside her, a loneliness that clung to her like a second skin. She didn't mind the solitude, or so she told herself. It gave her peace. But every now and then, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, the emptiness crept in, gnawing at her heart. There were whispers in town. Some called her a freak. Others simply avoided her, afraid of what they didn't understand. There was no place for a woman like Lila in the traditional world of Willow Creek. Not someone so strong, so unyielding. The other women would look at her, then turn away. They didn't know what to make of her. The men, too, were afraid to look her in the eye. They didn't know if she was a threat or a curiosity, and they certainly didn't know how to approach her. But Lila had long given up on trying to fit in. She had the land, she had her work, and that was enough. Until one fateful day when a stranger arrived in Willow Creek. His name was Ethan, a young cowboy who had heard the rumors about Lila and decided to see for himself. He wasn't from Willow Creek, and he had no preconceived notions about the people there. He was just passing through, looking for work and a place to rest. He'd heard about the giant cowgirl who worked alone up in the hills, and the stories fascinated him. Curious, he made his way up the rugged paths to her ranch, his horse's hooves kicking up dust behind him. When he arrived, he saw her, standing tall against the horizon, a silhouette framed by the golden light of the setting sun. She didn't look like the kind of woman he had grown up with. She was wild, untamed, and yet there was something about her that drew him in. Lila turned her head when she heard the sound of hooves, and their eyes met for the first time. Ethan felt a spark of recognition, as though he had been searching for her his entire life. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. She just watched him, her gaze steady, almost challenging. He didn't flinch. Instead, he dismounted his horse and stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "You're the one they call Lila, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low but confident. Lila studied him for a moment, taking in his lean build, his easy confidence, and the faint glint of curiosity in his eyes. "I am," she said simply, her voice rough from years of working the land. "What brings you up here?" Ethan paused for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "I was looking for work," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "And I've heard stories about you. I thought I'd see if they were true." Lila chuckled softly, though it was a sound tinged with bitterness. "What kind of stories?" she asked, her voice filled with both amusement and something deeper. "Stories about the giant cowgirl who does it all alone," Ethan said, taking a step closer. "The woman who doesn't need anyone." Lila's expression softened, just slightly. "And what do you think about that?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I think it's impressive," he said. "But I also think," he took another step closer, his voice growing softer, "you might be a little lonely." Lila didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped back, crossing her arms. She wasn't used to people getting so close, especially not men. They always seemed to want something from her, whether it was her strength or her approval. But Ethan was different. He didn't seem afraid of her, and he wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just there. The moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Lila asked, "You've never been kissed, have you?" The question hung in the air, startling Ethan. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The tension between them was palpable, and for the first time, Lila felt the weight of her own loneliness. "No," Ethan said finally, his voice low and sincere. "I haven't." And with that, Lila took a step closer, her breath catching in her throat as she closed the space between them. The air was thick with tension as Lila took a step closer to Ethan. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from fear, but from something she hadn't felt in a long time, desire. She could see the vulnerability in his eyes, something raw and unguarded that matched her own feelings. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before, something buried deep beneath the years of hard work, isolation, and silence. But now, standing in front of him, it felt impossible to ignore. Ethan, the cowboy who had come into her life so unexpectedly, wasn't like the others. He didn't shy away from her strength, nor did he seem intimidated by the size of her. He saw her, really saw her, and for the first time in years, she felt seen. She wasn't just the giant cowgirl, the woman who could lift and carry more than any man in town. She was just Lila, and for that brief moment, that was enough. Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on hers as the silence stretched between them. "Lila," he said softly, his voice tinged with wonder, You're not what I expected." Lila smiled, a small, wry smile, the kind that was as much for herself as it was for him. "What did you expect?" she asked, her voice low, her heart racing. Ethan hesitated, as if he were searching for the right words. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought you'd be different. Hard, maybe. Closed off." Lila's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, pride, but also something else, something she wasn't ready to face. "And what am I now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step closer, his hand reaching out hesitantly. You're a woman," he said quietly. "A woman who deserves more than what she's been given." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her with the force of everything she had kept buried for so long. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. No one had ever dared. "I've never met anyone like you," Ethan continued, his voice steady now, but full of something that made Lila's pulse quicken. "You're strong, but you're kind. You're independent, but you're also lonely." The last word hung in the air, hanging between them like a truth neither of them had been ready to admit. Lila swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had been alone for so long. Her ranch, her cattle, her work, it was all she had ever known. She had built her life around being strong, around not needing anyone. But standing there, looking at Ethan, she realized how much she had longed for something more. Something real. "Ethan, she started, but she couldn't find the words. "It's okay," Ethan interrupted, his voice gentle, understanding. "You don't have to say anything." He reached out and gently cupped her cheek with his hand, his touch soft but firm. Lila closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his touch wash over her. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel something other than the weight of the world on her shoulders. She let herself feel something vulnerable, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "You're not alone, Lila," Ethan whispered, his lips barely brushing against her ear. "Not anymore." And with that, Lila let herself believe it for the first time. The walls she had spent years building around her heart began to crumble, piece by piece. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the giant cowgirl, the woman who was too strong, too different, too much. She felt like a woman who could finally be loved. Ethan stepped back slightly, his eyes searching hers, asking for permission. Lila nodded slowly, her breath hitching in her throat. "Kiss me, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she had kept inside. And without another word, Ethan leaned in, closing the distance between them, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, as if neither of them quite believed it was happening. But then, as the world around them seemed to fade away, it deepened, and Lila felt something shift within her. It was as if the years of loneliness, of isolation, of being misunderstood, all melted away in that one moment. In Ethan's arms, she was no longer the giant cowgirl. She was simply Lila, a woman who had found something she had been searching for her whole life. Ethan pulled away slowly, his forehead resting against hers. "I told you," he murmured softly. "You're not alone." Lila smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached all the way to her eyes. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the rugged hills of Willow Creek. The peaceful quiet of the morning was broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass and the distant lowing of cattle. But for Lila, everything felt different. There was a sense of calm, of possibility, that had been absent for so long. As she stood at the window, watching the sunrise, her thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. The kiss they shared the night before had changed something deep within her. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. Hope that maybe she didn't have to do everything alone. Hope that there was more to life than the work, the silence, and the isolation. Ethan had come into her life like a storm, shaking everything up, but in a way that left her feeling more alive than she had in a long time. She couldn't deny the connection between them. He didn't judge her for her size or her strength. He didn't look at her like she was some kind of oddity. He saw her for who she truly was, a woman, strong and capable, but also vulnerable and yearning for something more. She turned away from the window and made her way down to the barn. The cows needed to be fed, the fences checked, and the day's work awaited. But this morning, the work felt different. It didn't feel like a burden, as it had so many times before. It felt like a way to fill the space that had once been empty. As she walked through the barn, she could hear the sound of hooves behind her. She turned to see Ethan walking toward her, his face split into a smile as wide as the sky. "Morning, Lila," he called, his voice warm and friendly. Lila couldn't help but smile back. There was something about his presence that made her feel grounded, like the earth beneath her feet was solid and real. "Morning, Ethan," she replied, her voice softer than usual. He stopped in front of her, his eyes scanning her face. "You're up early," he said, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "Yeah," she answered, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I've got a lot to do." "I was thinking," Ethan said, his voice a little hesitant. "Maybe I could help. I've worked on ranches before. I know a thing or two about cattle." Lila raised an eyebrow, not used to anyone offering help without expecting something in return. "You sure about that?" she asked, her tone skeptical but not unkind. "I'm sure," Ethan replied with a grin. "I'm not afraid of hard work." Lila considered him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, you can help. But don't expect me to go easy on you just because you're new here." Ethan laughed, the sound light and easy. "Wouldn't dream of it." They spent the morning working together, side by side. Lila showed Ethan the ropes, teaching him how to handle the cattle, how to mend the fences, and how to manage the day's tasks. To her surprise, he picked it all up quickly, proving himself capable and strong in his own right. As the day wore on, Lila couldn't help but notice the way Ethan looked at her. It was different from the way anyone else had ever looked at her. There was no fear, no judgment, just admiration. And maybe something more, something that made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't felt in years. After a long day of work, they sat down on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the land. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the sky, and for a moment, they were both silent. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of understanding, of shared moments. "You know," Ethan said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "I've never met anyone like you, Lila." Lila looked over at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "you're not just strong, you're something else. You're kind, and you're brave, and you don't let anyone tell you who you should be. That's rare." Lila felt her breath catch in her throat. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. People were always focused on her strength, her independence, but no one ever saw the other side of her, the part that wanted to be loved, to be seen as more than just a giant cowgirl. She looked down at her hands, the calluses worn from years of work, and for the first time, she didn't feel ashamed of them. She didn't feel like a monster. "You really think that?" she asked softly. "I do," Ethan said, his voice steady. He reached out and gently took her hand in his. Lila looked at their intertwined fingers, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It was as if a dam had broken, and all the emotions she had been holding in for so long rushed to the surface. "You're not alone, Lila," Ethan whispered. "Not anymore." And in that moment, Lila believed him. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. She had Ethan now, and maybe, just maybe, that was all she needed. The next few days felt like a new chapter in Lila's life. The mornings were filled with laughter and shared work, and the evenings with quiet moments on the porch, where the sky stretched out endlessly before them. Ethan had proven himself more than capable on the ranch. His natural skill with animals and his willingness to learn made him an invaluable partner. Lila had never been one to depend on anyone, but with Ethan, she found herself letting go of that fear. He didn't push her to change. Instead, he made her feel like she was enough, just as she was. As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. They spoke of the past, Lila's struggles with loneliness and the isolation she had chosen for herself, and of their hopes for the future. Ethan opened up about his family, how he had left home seeking freedom, and how Willow Creek and Lila had changed everything for him. But even as their connection deepened, there was a quiet tension beneath it all. Lila wasn't used to someone caring for her, especially someone who had nothing to prove. She had always been the one to give, to protect, and to fight for herself. Letting Ethan in, truly letting him in, felt like an enormous risk. One evening, as the two of them worked late into the night, the tension between them finally reached its breaking point. Lila had just finished repairing a section of the fence when she turned to find Ethan watching her, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place. "Lila," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I need to talk to you about something." She wiped her hands on her jeans, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking a lot about us," Ethan continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "About this, about what we're doing here." Lila felt a pang in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Ethan took a step closer, his expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. "Lila, I don't want to just be some passing cowboy in your life. I want more than that." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that sent a rush of emotions flooding through Lila's veins. She had known that their connection was special, but hearing him say it out loud made her heart race. "Ethan, she started, but the words got stuck in her throat. She had always been afraid of commitment, afraid of letting someone get too close, of being hurt. "I'm not asking for anything crazy," Ethan said quickly, as if reading her mind. "I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I care about you, Lila." Lila swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never allowed herself to feel this vulnerable, and it terrified her. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what might happen. She stepped toward him, closing the gap between them. "I care about you too, Ethan," she whispered, her voice shaky but sincere. Ethan smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made Lila's heart flutter. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his touch warm and reassuring. "Then let's take this one step at a time," he said, his voice low and comforting. Lila nodded, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. She had spent so long guarding her heart, building walls around herself to keep others out. But with Ethan, she felt the walls start to crumble. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to take the risk. "One step at a time," she repeated softly. And with that, Ethan leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was tender, full of promise, and everything she had been longing for. The kiss wasn't rushed or desperate. It was slow, as if they were both savoring the moment, allowing the connection between them to deepen. When they finally pulled away, both of them were breathless, their faces inches apart. "I'm glad you came into my life, Ethan," Lila whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd find someone like you." Ethan smiled, his eyes sparkling with affection. "I feel the same way, Lila. I've never met anyone like you." The night stretched on, and for the first time, Lila felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Ethan, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to change everything. As the days turned into weeks, Lila and Ethan grew closer. The ranch, once a place of solitude and endless work, became a shared space, filled with the hum of two people working together, side by side. There was a rhythm to their days, a quiet understanding that they were building something neither of them had expected. Lila found herself smiling more often, the weight of her past solitude lifting with every passing day. She had never imagined that something as simple as companionship could feel so fulfilling. But even as the warmth between them grew, Lila knew the peace they had found was fragile. Deep down, she carried a fear she had never been able to shake. The fear that the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself would come crumbling down, and she would once again be left to pick up the pieces of her heart. Ethan, for all his warmth and reassurance, was a man with his own past, and Lila knew better than to let herself believe that things could stay this perfect forever. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills, Ethan turned to her, his face serious. "Lila," he began, his voice softer than usual. "We need to talk about something." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She could sense the weight in his words before he even said them. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ethan paused for a moment, his eyes searching hers, as though weighing his words. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he said finally. "About our future." Lila's stomach twisted at the word. The future. It was something she had avoided thinking about for so long. She had always focused on the present, the work, the routine, the small victories and quiet moments. But the future, with its uncertainties and promises, had always been something she couldn't quite wrap her mind around. "What about our future?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Ethan's gaze softened. "I don't want to rush anything, Lila," he said, his words sincere. "But I need to know if you're willing to make a life with me. Not just here, but together." His words hit her like a wave, washing over her with the force of everything she had been avoiding. Lila felt a lump rise in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. Could she do this? Could she let someone in, truly let someone in, after everything she had been through? "I've never asked you to make any promises," Ethan continued, sensing her hesitation. "But I need to know where you stand." The silence between them stretched out, heavy and thick with unspoken fears. Lila looked out over the land, her eyes tracing the horizon where the sun had just dipped below the hills. The same horizon she had always looked to for answers, but had never found. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she wasn't alone. A future where Ethan was by her side, helping her shoulder the weight of the world. She had always been the strong one, the one who did it all herself. But maybe it was time to let go of that pride. Maybe it was time to trust in something more than herself. "I don't know what the future holds," Lila said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "But I know I don't want to face it alone." Ethan's face broke into a smile, relief flooding his features. He reached out and took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to," he said softly. "Not anymore." And for the first time in a long time, Lila allowed herself to believe it. She didn't have all the answers, and there were still many uncertainties ahead, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As they sat there, hand in hand, watching the stars slowly begin to twinkle in the night sky, Lila realized that the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. Together. As the weeks passed, Lila and Ethan's bond deepened. The days spent working together, learning from one another, and sharing quiet moments seemed to blur into one long stretch of contentment. The work on the ranch was hard, but it no longer felt like a burden. Each task, whether it was mending fences, tending to the cattle, or preparing the barn for the coming winter, was a shared effort, something that bound them together in ways that words could never quite capture. Despite the peaceful rhythm of their days, a storm was brewing in the distance. Lila had known it was coming, but had refused to acknowledge it, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she could ignore the whispers that always followed her, the whispers about her past. Ethan, too, seemed unaware of the storm, though his silence spoke volumes. He had never asked about her past, never pushed her to open up. But Lila could feel the weight of it growing between them, a secret that was slowly choking the space that had once felt so safe. One evening, as the last light of day faded into twilight, Lila stood on the porch, looking out across the land. The cool breeze carried the scent of earth and sage, and for a moment, she allowed herself to be lost in it. She wasn't alone here, not anymore. Ethan had become her partner in every sense of the word, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Ethan walked up beside her, his presence as steady as the mountains that stood in the distance. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice low, his hand brushing against hers. Lila turned to face him, the weight of her secret pressing on her chest. "I've been thinking about the past," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "About what I left behind." Ethan nodded but didn't say anything, giving her the space to continue. Lila took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've never told you everything, Ethan. About why I ended up here, living alone on this ranch. About the people I used to know." Ethan's expression softened, and he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready," he said, his voice full of understanding. But Lila shook her head, her heart pounding. She had spent so many years running from her past, from the people she had hurt, and those who had hurt her. It was time to face it, to face the truth. "No, it's time," she whispered. "I can't keep carrying it alone." She paused, her eyes searching his. "Ethan, I was married once, years ago, to someone who wasn't kind, someone who didn't understand me. I left him, and I left everything behind. The ranch, the people, the life I had. I thought if I could just escape, if I could just disappear, I could start fresh." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Ethan's hand tightened on her shoulder, his touch warm and steady. "What happened to him?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle, but filled with concern. Lila swallowed hard, the memories of those days flooding back. "He didn't let me go?" "Easily. He followed me for months, threatening me, trying to bring me back. Eventually, I had to leave everything behind, even my family, to get away. I came here to start over, to forget. But the past never really leaves you, does it?" She looked at Ethan, her eyes searching his face for some sign of judgment. But there was none, only understanding. He stepped closer, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "You don't have to carry it by yourself anymore," he whispered. "I'm here, Lila. I'm not going anywhere." Lila closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the warmth of his embrace. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. Ethan wasn't just a man she had met on a whim. He was the one who had come into her life when she least expected it, and he had shown her that she didn't have to face the world alone. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, no longer filled with secrets. It was the silence of two people who had found something worth fighting for. "I don't know what the future holds," Lila said softly, looking up at him. "But I know I want to face it with you." Ethan smiled, his eyes bright with affection. "Then that's all we need, Lila. We'll take it one day at a time, together." The stars began to appear in the sky above them, twinkling softly in the vastness of the night. For the first time in a long time, Lila felt like she could breathe. The past may never fully go away, but with Ethan by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. They stood together in the quiet of the evening, their hands intertwined, knowing that the future was theirs to build, one step at a time. The days that followed felt like a peaceful lull after the storm, as though the world had decided to give Lila and Ethan a moment to breathe. They worked side by side, each task becoming easier and more natural as they grew more accustomed to each other's presence. Lila found herself enjoying the rhythm of the work, the way Ethan's quiet strength complemented her own. She had never allowed herself to rely on anyone, but with him, it felt right. It was more than just the work. It was the companionship, the small moments they shared, like when Ethan would hum softly while mending a fence, or when Lila would catch him stealing a glance at her, a look that was full of warmth and understanding. Everything felt like it was falling into place. But even in the midst of this newfound peace, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would challenge everything they had built. It had been weeks since she had opened up to Ethan about her past, and though he had been nothing but supportive, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her secrets hanging over them. There was still a part of her, deep down, that was afraid. Afraid that Ethan might see her past as something she couldn't escape from, afraid that he would one day turn away when the truth came to light. It wasn't just her past she feared, it was the future. She had never known what it was like to plan for a life with someone, and the idea of trusting someone fully, of letting go of her carefully built walls, was still terrifying. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, the sun dipping low in the sky, Ethan turned to her with a look of seriousness in his eyes. "Lila," he said, his voice low and steady. "There's something we need to talk about." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment was coming, but she had hoped it would be a little further off. She met his gaze, trying to mask the unease that crept over her. "What is it?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of hesitation. Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers. "I've been thinking about the future," he said, his tone gentle. "About us. About what comes next." Lila felt a knot form in her stomach. She had never been good at thinking about the future. The future always felt uncertain, like a storm just waiting to break. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. Ethan reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I'm not asking for any big promises, Lila," he said. "But I want to know what you see when you think about the future. About what we've built here." Lila's chest tightened as she thought about the life they had created together, the long days of work, the quiet nights under the stars, the simple but beautiful moments they shared. She had never allowed herself to hope for something like this, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to hold on to it. "I see us," she said slowly, her voice thick with emotion. "I see us together, but I don't know how to make that happen. I've never planned for a future like this. I don't know how to trust that it won't fall apart." Ethan's expression softened, and he gently cupped her face in his hands. "Lila, I'm not asking for you to have all the answers," he said quietly. "I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The sincerity in his words hit her like a wave, crashing over the walls she had spent so many years building. Lila closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the weight of his promise, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe it. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been alone for so long. I don't know how to let someone in." Ethan leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers. "You don't have to do it alone anymore, Lila," he whispered. "You have me." Lila opened her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always been afraid of trusting someone, of allowing herself to be vulnerable, but with Ethan, it felt different. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future would bring, but in that moment, she knew she didn't have to face it alone. "Okay," she said softly, her voice filled with resolve. "We'll take it one step at a time." Ethan smiled, his eyes bright with affection. "One step at a time," he agreed. And in that moment, Lila knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The future didn't seem so frightening when she had someone by her side. They sat there for a while, the world around them quiet and still, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh start. And for the first time in a long time, Lila allowed herself to hope. As the seasons shifted, so did the mood on the ranch. The once quiet and peaceful landscape had begun to take on new life, not just in the fields and pastures, but in the hearts of those who worked it. Lila and Ethan had built something together, not just a life, but a bond that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. Yet, even as they worked side by side, Lila could feel the weight of something looming in the distance. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but something she couldn't quite shake. A shadow of doubt that always seemed to hang over her, even in the brightest moments. She had never been one to believe in fairy tales, and the simple, quiet life she had now with Ethan seemed too perfect to be real. It was as if the world was about to remind her of the past she had worked so hard to leave behind. One day, as they were out working the fields, a rider appeared on the horizon. At first, Lila thought it was just a passing stranger, but as the rider drew closer, her heart sank. It was a man she recognized, someone she had hoped she would never see again. His presence was a cold reminder of the life she had fled from, the life she had tried to escape. Ethan noticed the change in her demeanor immediately. He turned to see what had caused the sudden tension in her, and when his eyes fell on the rider, he could see the worry in Lila's face. The rider pulled up in front of them, his horse's hooves kicking up dust as he came to a stop. The man was tall, dressed in fine clothes, with a cold, calculating expression on his face. Lila's stomach churned as she recognized him. It was Luke, her ex-husband. "Lila," Luke said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "I thought I might find you here." Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself between Lila and the man. His stance was protective, but he didn't say a word. Lila could see the recognition in Luke's eyes. but there was no sign of remorse, only the same arrogance that had marked his presence when they were married. "What do you want, Luke?" Lila asked, her voice steady but her hands clenched at her sides. Luke's eyes flicked to Ethan, and a small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "I see you found someone new," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Don't tell me you're planning on making a life with this man." Lila felt a wave of anger rise within her, but she refused to let Luke see it. "I'm not planning anything with you," she said, her voice cold. "This is my life now. You don't get to come here and try to tear it apart." Luke's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer to her, his tone darkening. "You think you can just walk away from everything, Lila? From me? From the life I gave you? You can't escape what's yours." Lila's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let him control her again. "I'm not yours anymore," she said firmly. "I left that life behind, and I'm never going back." Ethan stepped forward, his jaw set in determination. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low and steady. "You've got no right to come to her home and threaten her." Luke turned his gaze on Ethan, sizing him up with a look of disdain. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "Some cowboy who thinks he can just take what's mine?" Ethan didn't flinch, standing his ground. "I'm someone who's going to make sure she's safe," he said. Luke sneered, then turned back to Lila. "You can pretend all you want, but the law says I still have rights to you. And I want you back, Lila, whether you like it or not." Lila's blood ran cold at his words. She had known that leaving him wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected him to come back like this. Ethan could sense her distress, and he placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent promise that he would stand with her. "You don't scare me, Luke," Lila said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Luke's eyes flashed with anger, but instead of continuing his threats, he simply turned on his heel and rode off, his figure disappearing into the distance. Lila stood there, her heart racing in her chest. She had faced him, but she knew this wasn't over. He would come back, and when he did, he would bring more than just words. Ethan remained by her side, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "He won't hurt you again, Lila," he said, his voice full of quiet conviction. Lila nodded, but inside, she knew the battle was far from over. Luke had made his intentions clear. He would stop at nothing to get her back, and she had to be ready for whatever came next. But for now, she had Ethan by her side, and that was enough to make her believe she could face whatever was waiting for her. The days after Luke's visit were filled with a quiet tension. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. She went about her daily tasks with Ethan by her side, but every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound of hooves, made her heart race. Ethan, sensing her unease, kept a watchful eye, but he never pressed her to talk about what happened. He knew that when she was ready, she would tell him. It wasn't long before Lila found herself standing at the edge of the ranch, staring out over the land, her heart heavy with thoughts of the future. Ethan approached her quietly, his steps light on the soft earth. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lila nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "I can feel him coming back. He won't let it go." Ethan stood next to her, his presence solid and reassuring. "You don't have to face him alone," he said firmly. "I'm here, Lila. I'll always be here." Lila turned to him, her eyes searching his face for the strength he promised. She had spent so many years running, so many years afraid of the future, but in that moment, she realized how far she had come. With Ethan by her side, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And I don't want to run anymore." The following week, as the sun began to dip below the hills, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. Lila's breath caught in her throat, and she turned to find Ethan already standing by her side, his hand resting on the rifle he kept close. "It's him," she said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet resolve. Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "Let him come." The rider approached, this time not alone. Luke was with 2 other men, and as they rode up to the ranch, Lila could see the determination in his eyes. This wasn't just a visit, it was a declaration. "Lila," Luke called, his voice carrying across the open space. "I gave you a chance. Now it's time to come home." Lila stood tall, her shoulders squared, facing him without fear. "I'm not going back, Luke," she said firmly. "I'm done with that life." Luke's expression darkened, and he motioned for his men to dismount. "You're making a mistake," he warned. "You don't get to just walk away from everything we had." Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between Lila and the men. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said, his voice calm but strong. Luke's gaze flickered to Ethan, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you?" he asked. "Another cowboy who thinks he can take what's mine?" Ethan didn't flinch. "I'm the man who's standing with her," he said, his voice unwavering. Luke sneered, but there was something in Ethan's stance that made him hesitate. The standoff hung in the air, thick with tension, but Lila could feel it shifting. She had spent so many years running from this, from the man who had once claimed ownership over her. But now, with Ethan standing beside her, the fear that had once paralyzed her began to fade. "You don't own me, Luke," Lila said, her voice stronger than she had ever heard it before. "I'm not a possession. I'm a person." Luke's face twisted with anger, but the words he had planned to say never left his mouth. Instead, he turned away, motioning for his men to follow. "This isn't over, Lila," he called over his shoulder, his voice laced with a threat. "I'll be back." Lila watched him ride off, his figure growing smaller as he disappeared into the distance. The weight that had settled in her chest over the past weeks slowly lifted, replaced by a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: freedom. Ethan moved beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's over now," he said softly. "He's not going to hurt you anymore." Lila nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "No, he's not." They stood together in silence, the weight of the past finally lifting, and for the first time in a long while, Lila felt the future open up before her. The ranch, the land, and the life they had built together were now hers to keep. No longer burdened by fear, Lila knew that she had the strength to face whatever came next. And as Ethan stood beside her, she realized that they weren't just facing the future together, they were creating it, one step at a time. With a deep breath, she looked out over the land, the sun setting on a new chapter of her life. And this time, she was ready to embrace it.